Everyone knows the story. Britain got China hooked on a drug to get rich. Clean, damning, and wrong. Opium was never the product. It was the plumbing. Britain had a problem money alone couldn't fix. China would sell tea and wanted absolutely nothing Britain made in return. So opium wasn't a vice being sold. It was the only pipe through which silver would flow in the right direction. Everything else you've heard is the cover story. Hold on to a date while I tell you this. 1842, late August. A treaty signed on a British warship anchored in the Yangtze. When we get there, you're going to notice something strange. About that document, something almost nobody points out. But not yet. For now, just sit with the version everyone believes. Wicked empire, addictive poison, profit. It's the version that fits on a poster. It makes you angry. And being angry feels like understanding. It isn't. Because if opium were really the point, if the drug itself were the prize, then the whole thing should have ended the moment the drug did. It didn't. The machine kept running for another 70 years after the last chest was sold, in places that had never seen a poppy. That's your first clue that you've been shown the wrong object. The drug was in the foreground, so you wouldn't look at the money. Let's look at the money. Start with a cup of tea. By the early 19th century, Britain didn't drink tea the way you enjoy a treat. It drank tea the way you breathe, a national dependency built into the working day, into the rhythm of every kitchen. And here's the part that matters. The government had learned to feed on that thirst. When Britain slashed the tea duty in 1784 from a punishing 119% down to 12.5%, it wasn't being generous. It was being clever. Cheap legal tea killed the smugglers, and consumption exploded. Retained imports jumped from under 5 million pounds of tea in 1 year to over 16 million the next. Every cup now carried a small, reliable tax straight into the treasury. Tea wasn't a luxury. It was infrastructure. It was revenue. But all that tea had to come from one place on earth, China. And China, gloriously, imperially indifferent, did not want British wool or British clocks or British anything. It wanted one thing in exchange for its tea: silver. Hard silver, by the ton, flowing east and never coming back. And this was not British paranoia. The Chinese court said it to their faces. When Britain sent a grand embassy under Lord Macartney in 1793 to open up trade, loaded with the finest manufactures the country could produce, the Qianlong Emperor sent back a reply to King George that has echoed for 2 centuries. His empire, he wrote, possessed all things in abundance, and had no use whatsoever for Britain's ingenious objects. Read it however you like, as arrogance, as confidence, as a civilization that genuinely needed nothing from the outside world. The economic consequence was the same either way. There was no product on earth that Britain could manufacture and sell to China to balance the books. The door to ordinary trade was shut, and when the front door of trade is bolted, an empire that must have your tea will start looking very hard for a window. That is the problem the entire story exists to solve. Not addiction, not morality. A balance of payments crisis. A nation that had made a drug of tea taxed itself on the habit and had no way to pay for the leaves except by bleeding silver it could not replace. So here is the flip. Write it down, because the next 25 minutes are just the proof of this one sentence. Opium was never a product Britain sold to China. Opium was a payment mechanism, the answer to a problem Britain could not solve any other way. It was the device that let Britain buy Chinese tea without spending British silver. The drug was never the destination. The drug was the pump. And I want you to understand before we tear it apart that as a piece of financial engineering, this machine was genuinely, coldly brilliant. Not evil genius, brilliant. Accountant, brilliant. The kind of brilliance you have to admire before you're allowed to be horrified by it. It began in a field in Bengal. In 1773, the East India Company took the Bengal opium trade into monopoly, and by 1797, it had stopped farming the work out and seized the whole process directly: growing, processing, packing. At its height, the system licensed something on the order of 1.5 million cultivators across the Gangetic Plain, each one legally bound to grow poppy for the state and to sell his entire harvest to no one but the state. Think about the sheer scale of that control. 1.5 million farmers, and not one of them permitted to sell to anyone else. The crop moved to 2 enormous factories, Gazipur on the Ganges for the Benares opium, and Patna for the Bihar, where it was weighed, worked, and pressed into chests, each one about 40 kilos, each one stamped with the authority of the government of India. Now watch the money move, because this is where the design gets beautiful. Link 1. The company grows the opium and auctions it at Calcutta for silver. Link 2. Private merchants carry that opium to the coast of China and sell it there for more silver. Link 3. That Chinese silver buys Chinese tea. Link 4. The tea sails home to Britain, where it is taxed on arrival, feeding the treasury 1 cup at a time. Look at what just happened. The silver that Britain would have lost buying tea, it never leaves the system. It goes out through opium and comes right back through tea. The circle closes. Britain gets its tea, keeps its silver, and collects tax at both ends of the loop. And the drug that made it all turn? For most of the 19th century, opium stood as the second largest single source of revenue for the entire British Indian Empire, behind only the tax on land itself. Not cotton, not spices. A narcotic sat one, rung below the ground beneath their feet in the imperial budget. And notice who took a cut at every turn. The company didn't just grow the opium, it auctioned it, and the auction itself was a revenue event, the state selling its own monopoly product to the highest bidder and pocketing the premium. Then the tea arrived in London and met the customs officer, and the crown took its share there too. The same loop was taxed on the way out as opium, and on the way in as tea. It is very hard to design a more efficient device for extracting money from a population that thinks it is simply enjoying a drink. That is not a trade triangle. A trade triangle is 3 countries swapping goods they each want. This is a fiscal triangle, 3 links, and every single one of them is a link in a government's budget, not a free market's handshake. The land tax funds the company. The opium monopoly funds the company. The tea duty funds the crown. Each hop is a tax collector wearing the costume of a merchant. It looked like commerce. It was accounting. And the genius of accounting, as any auditor will tell you, is that it draws the eye to the columns it wants you to read and away from the ones it doesn't. Everyone was looking at the drug. The drug was the column they wanted you to read. Let me make this real. Forget the millions of chests and follow just one. It's the 1830s. A single chest of opium 40 kilos, sealed and certified at the Patna factory, begins its life as the property of the East India Company. It rides down the Ganges to Calcutta, and there, in a company auction house, it is sold to the highest bidder. Watch this moment carefully, because it is the cleverest thing in the entire story. The company takes its silver at that auction, and then it lets go. It does not put the chest on its own ships. It does not carry it to China. It sells to a private trader, a so-called country trader, and turns its back. Why? Because opium was contraband in China. It was illegal there, forbidden by imperial decree. And the East India Company held the tea trade, the respectable trade, the trade with Britain's blessing. It could not be caught red-handed, running narcotics into a country. It needed to keep sweet. So it built a firewall out of paperwork. The company grew the drug, the company packaged the drug, the company sold the drug at auction, and then, at the precise moment, the drug became a crime. The company was no longer holding it. The state builds the gun, sells it across a counter, and is careful to be looking the other way before it's fired. So our chest changes hands. Now it belongs to a private firm, and it sails east, down to the mouth of the Pearl River, to a place called Linton, an island where the receiving ships sat permanently, at anchor, floating warehouses beyond the reach of Chinese law. There the chest is transferred again, to Chinese smuggling boats fast, oared craft, the crews called fast crabs and scrambling dragons that dart it past the customs stations and up the rivers, inland, to the dealers, to the dens, to the buyers. Picture the scene at Linton for a moment, because it captures the whole absurd architecture in one image. Here are British and American ships riding at permanent anchor off a Chinese island, loaded with a cargo that is completely illegal to land, and everyone knows it. The Chinese smugglers know it, the provincial officials know it, and many of them are quietly paid to know it and do nothing. The receiving ship captains know it. And yet the trade runs with the smooth regularity of a scheduled ferry, day after day, chest after chest, because every party in the chain is making money, and no single party is legally holding the drug on Chinese soil, in a way that anyone in authority is willing to notice. It is a crime organized so precisely that responsibility for it has been engineered out of existence. And at every single one of those handoffs, silver moves the other way, back down the river, back to Linton, back to Calcutta. Our one chest is not really a box of drug at all. It is a bucket in a chain of buckets, and the thing being bailed, hand over hand, from the interior of China all the way back to the vaults of British India is silver. The opium is just the shape the silver travels in. Now, everything I've described so far, I've described with a kind of admiration because the mechanism deserves it. But a machine has costs, and the costs of this one were never on the ledger at Calcutta. They were paid somewhere else, by someone else. And this is where I have to change how I'm speaking to you, because we are about to stop talking about silver and start talking about people. The first hidden cost was human, and it does not belong in the wry, clever register we've been using. So I'll set that register down. The volume of opium flowing into China did not hold steady. It climbed, and then it surged. Imports ran at around 4,500 chests a year in 1810. By 1838, that figure had reached 40,000. That is not a market being served. That is a dependency being manufactured, deliberately, at industrial scale, because the machine required ever more silver to flow back the other way, and every additional chest was a demand for it. Behind that number is a human catastrophe that a channel about economics does not get to wave away with a statistic. Millions of people and the quiet wreckage of ordinary lives, households, livelihoods, bodies. The number 40,000 is easy to say. What it purchased in human terms was not. I am not going to dress that in a clever line. It doesn't get one. The second hidden cost was structural, and it aimed straight at the Chinese state. Because remember what the opium was for. It was a pump, and what it pumped was silver, outward. In the early 1820s, the silver leaving China ran at perhaps 2 million taels. By the 1830s, that outflow had reached something like 9 million. And silver was not a commodity in imperial China. Silver was money. It was the metal in which taxes were assessed and debts were settled. To feel why that mattered, you have to understand that China ran on two metals at once. Peasants earned, spent, and saved in copper coin the money of daily life. But the state assessed its taxes in silver. Ordinarily, the exchange rate between the two held roughly steady, and the system worked. But as silver drained out of the country, it grew scarce. And scarce silver grew expensive in copper terms. And here is the cruelty buried in the mechanism. A farmer who owed a fixed amount of silver in tax now had to hand over more and more copper to buy that silver, even though his tax, on paper, had not risen by a single coin. His burden climbed for reasons he could never see, dictated by the price of a metal moving on ships he would never lay eyes on. The machine wasn't just selling a drug into China. It was quietly reaching into the country's monetary system and pulling on the one thread that held the whole cloth together. That is the cost that could not stay hidden. A foreign empire had found a way to drain the money supply of a nation of hundreds of millions, and to do it at a profit through a substance that also happened to be poisoning the population. Sooner or later, a state notices when its blood is leaving its body. China was about to notice. The rupture, when it came, had a name. In 1839, the emperor sent a hard, incorruptible official named Lin Zexu south to Canton with orders to end the opium trade for good. And Lin did something no one on the British side thought a Chinese official would dare. He didn't take a bribe. He blockaded the foreign merchants in their own quarter, and he demanded every chest of opium they held. Then he took it more than 20,000 chests and destroyed it, dissolved it in trenches, and flushed it into the sea. He even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking how a nation that banned opium at home could inflict it abroad. The letter, famously, was never delivered. Now, here is the moment. The honest version of this story has to slow down, because the popular telling races straight from Lin's trenches to the gunboats, and it skips a real argument. The neat story says, opium drained China's silver. That drain wrecked the economy, and so China struck back. And that's the version I gave you a minute ago. But I owe you the part that version leaves out, because some economic historians push back on it. Hard. Recent work argues the silver drain has been badly overstated, that the silver actually flowing out to India was several times smaller than China's trade deficit would suggest, and that other forces were pulling at China's silver at exactly the same time. The independence wars in Spanish America had choked off the new, World mines that had supplied China's silver for centuries. And frightened people hoard metal in a crisis. A lot of that missing silver may never have left China at all. It went under the floorboards, not onto a ship. So which is it? Here's the honest answer. And notice that it makes the story bigger, not smaller. It doesn't actually matter, for our purposes, exactly how many tales the opium trade pulled out of China. What matters is that the Qing state believed it was losing control of its own money, and it was right to be afraid, whatever the precise cause. The opium was a real drain and a real poison. It was also the visible villain in a monetary crisis that had several authors. And when a government sees its silver vanishing and its people addicted, it does not wait for the economic historians to finish arguing. It acts. Lin acted, and in doing so, he turned a quiet accounting machine into a war that would finally reveal what the machine had been protecting all along. So Britain went to war. And when you ask why send a fleet across the world over a contraband drug, the government itself pretended not to touch. You arrive at the strangest, sharpest truth in this entire story. The exact thing that made the machine brilliant was the exact thing that made it impossible to end without a war. It's the same edge. Let me show you both sides of it. The genius of the design, remember, was that opium was never really a product. It was a payment mechanism, a way to move silver dressed up as a good. That's what made it so clean. Britain never had to defend a drug at a negotiating table. On paper, there was nothing to defend. The company's hands were clean. The opium was always someone else's crime by the time it reached the coast. The strength of the system was that it had no official existence. It was pure flow. But turn the edge over. Because opium was structured as a flow of silver and not as a product, there was nothing you could actually put on a table and bargain away. You can negotiate a product. You can tax it, restrict it, trade a concession on it. You cannot negotiate a direction. What Britain was really defending was not the right to sell a drug. It was the right to keep silver, moving the way the machine needed it to move. And a direction of flow is not a clause in a contract. It is a fact you can only enforce with a navy. The very abstraction that made the trade deniable made it non-negotiable. You can outlaw a product. You cannot outlaw a direction. You can only overpower the country trying to reverse it. That is the same edge flip, and it's worth saying is one sentence. The thing that made opium unstoppable, that it was never a product, only a flow, was the very thing that made it impossible to stop without force. Lin Zexu could seize 20,000 chests. He could dissolve every gram of the drug in the sea, and it would change nothing, because the drug was never the point. The point was the direction of the silver, and you cannot pour a direction into a trench. The only way to settle which way the silver flowed was to decide who had the bigger guns. So that is what the two sides did. Which brings us back to the date I asked you to hold, 1842, August. The Treaty of Nanking, signed, aboard a British warship after China's coast had been battered into submission. Now, I want you to do something. Go and read that treaty, and look for the word opium. You will not find it. The document that ended the Opium War does not mention opium. Let that land for a second, because it is the single most revealing fact in the whole affair. If the war had really been about a drug, the drug would be in the peace. It isn't. What's in the peace is money, and control of money. Look at the terms. First, an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. And look at how it breaks down. 6 million for the opium Lin had destroyed, 3 million for old debts, and 12 million for the cost of the war itself. China would pay Britain, in silver, for the privilege of having been defeated, the flow reversed by decree. Second, the island of Hong Kong, handed over a permanent British foothold on the Chinese coast. And third, the quiet clause, the one that never makes the posters. China agreed that its tariffs, the taxes it charged on trade, at its own ports, would be fixed by treaty at a fair and reasonable rate. Read that in plain language. China gave up the right to set its own customs duties. Do you see what just happened? The war was fought, supposedly, over a drug that isn't even named in the settlement. Because the drug was never the prize. The prize was the flow, and here it is, seized in black and white. An indemnity that forces silver back toward Britain, a port to control the coast, and a tariff clause that takes from China the most basic power a state has over its own economy, the power to decide what its own trade is taxed. The machine didn't win the right to sell opium. It won the right to control the direction of the money. The drug walked out of the story the moment the guns fell silent, exactly as it had walked out at the Calcutta auction, leaving the silver behind. And if a treaty that never mentions opium still isn't proof enough for you, wait 16 years. Because there was a second war from 1856 to 1860, and it ended with a second settlement, the Treaty of Tientsin, ratified at Peking in 1860. And this time, watch what the victors did with the drug. They did not ban it. They did not even pretend to. They legalized it. Opium became a regular, taxed, above-board import with a duty fixed on it like any other good. Sit with the enormity of that reversal. The thing everyone insists the wars were fought to force upon China was, in the end, not smuggled but licensed, brought into the daylight and slotted neatly into the customs schedule, another line item feeding the revenue. If the drug had been the point, you would legalize it to guarantee the supply. But they legalized it to guarantee the tax. Even the poison, in the end, was just another thing to put a duty on. The flow was always the prize. The drug was only ever its vehicle. And once that principle was established that a foreign power could reach in and take hold of the machinery of China's public finances, it did not stop. It deepened and it locked. Follow it forward a generation. By the 1860s, China's own customs service, the office that collected the tariffs at its ports, was being run, at the top, by a foreigner. An Ulsterman named Robert Hart served as Inspector General of the Chinese Maritime Customs for 45 years, from 1863 to 1908. Sit with the strangeness of that. The man at the head of China's customs house, collecting China's import taxes, was not Chinese. And the money that flowed through his honest, efficient, meticulous office customs revenue that climbed from about 7 million taels in the 1860s to 22 million, by the 1890s to 35 million, by the 1900s was, increasingly, not China's to keep. As war indemnities piled up, that customs revenue was pledged, earmarked, promised in advance to foreign creditors as the security on China's debts. And the trap tightened with every defeat. Reached the end of the century. 1901, the settlement, after the Boxer Uprising, and the mechanism arrives at its purest, most naked form. The powers imposed an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, a sum larger than the entire annual revenue of the Chinese state. Stretched over 40 years with interest, it would come to nearly 1 billion taels. And how was a debt that size to be guaranteed? By pledging China's most dependable income streams directly to the creditors. The maritime customs, the transit duties, and the salt tax. The same customs house, the same silver, signed away, in advance, for 2 generations, to the very powers that had defeated it. That is the structural lock. This is why no one could simply stop it. China's tax revenue was now the collateral on China's foreign debt, which meant foreigners had every incentive to keep the collection efficient and the sovereignty weak. The better Robert Hart did his job, the more securely China's own customs house served as the repayment engine for the powers it owed. It was self-reinforcing. Debt secured against customs, customs administered by the creditors, the whole apparatus turning smoothly, honestly, and entirely in the wrong direction. You cannot revolt your way out of a trap that is built out of your own tax office. The machine was no longer something done to China from outside. It had been installed inside. And now for the detail. That should make the hair on your neck stand up, because it proves this was never really about opium, or even about China at all. In 1881, on the other side of Asia, a different empire went bankrupt. The Ottoman Empire, drowning in European loans it could not repay, signed a decree that created something called the Public Debt Administration. And its structure, I need you to hear this, was identical. A council, dominated by European creditors, was given the right to collect Ottoman state revenues directly. The salt monopoly, the tobacco monopoly, the stamp tax, the tax on silk and spirits. The money went to pay the empire's European bondholders. No one had conquered Constantinople. No treaty port had been seized. And yet the Ottomans had handed over the same thing. The Chinese had the right to tax themselves, collected by foreigners, pledged to foreign debt. 2 empires, 2 continents, no shared drug, no shared war, 1 machine. And that tells you what the machine actually was. It was never about opium. Opium was one particularly dark way of running it. The machine itself is older and simpler and colder than any drug. So here is the law this whole story was written to prove. Sovereignty is not lost on the battlefield. It is lost at the customs house. Whoever controls the direction a nation's money is allowed to flow, controls the nation, and needs no crown to do it. And beneath it, the secondary law, an empire's most profitable tax will always disguise itself as trade, because trade is respectable and a tax is not. Which is why the popular story, Wicked Britain, addictive drug, profit was never wrong so much as small. It hands you a villain and a poison, and lets you feel the anger and move on. But the machine doesn't care whether you're angry. It only cares which way the silver flows. So let me give you back the sentence I promised at the start, now that you can feel the weight in it. The Opium Wars were never fought over a drug. They were fought over which direction silver was allowed to flow. And before you decide this is all safely locked in the 19th century, go and look, today, at what happens when a country cannot pay its foreign debts. Nobody sends a fleet up the river anymore. They don't have to. The machine learned to work without one. Instead, the creditors arrive with a term sheet and read what they ask to control first. Not the army, not the palace, the revenue. They want a say in the customs, the state monopolies, the tax collection, the flow conditions attached to the rescue, priorities set on where the money goes before it can go anywhere else. Sometimes a country pledges its port or its mineral royalties or its customs receipts as the security on a loan it cannot refuse. It is the Ottoman Debt Administration in a business suit. It is Robert Hart's customs house with better paperwork. No poppy required. Because the machine was never about opium, and it was never really about Britain. Those were the costumes it wore in one particular century. Strip them off, and what remains is the oldest idea in the ledger. That you do not need to conquer a country if you can quietly own the direction its money is allowed to flow. The drug was a detail. The machine is still running.